When it comes to balance, is it really Nerf or nothing? Hello everyone, Bront CatHerder here. We're having some fun talking Raid Shadow Legends, or at least I hope we're having some fun, because we're going to talk about the topic of nerfing and balance. Because that has been a very hot topic of late. There's been a lot of content creators that have weighed in on this recently, and I've got some opinions, and I felt I'd like to share and see what you guys thought about some of my thoughts on this. Hopefully this does not get to be canceled. I can see you guys over there with the pitchforks. Please put the pitchforks and the torches down. Thank you, thank you, thank you. For me, balance has got a bit of a special place in my heart as somebody who has crafted RPGs and long-running campaigns where we had to balance 20, 30, 50, 100, 200, 300 players in different campaigns, or build a gaming system where we needed people to be able to play on some kind of an even level. And depending on what type of game you're playing, how much balance is important can really, impact things a little bit. And Raid's got a lot of PvE stuff that doesn't require it, but I've got a lot of insight into balance some of these larger things in the RPG market, and Raid's an RPG at its core. At least it's got similar mechanics. So I wanted to weigh in on this a little bit. This is not to say I'm the only expert. It's not to say that you have to agree with me. In fact, I welcome you guys to agree with me or disagree with me in the comments. I definitely appreciate them. Try to keep it constructive. I'm going to try to keep this as constructive. I'm going to try to focus on what we're doing with nerfs. So the real tricky part about understanding nerfs first is that ultimately there's a reason that people don't like nerfs in just about anything, and it's a big of psychological. You've got nerfs and you've got buffs. Psychologically, buffs feel better than nerfs because a buff is giving something or adding power or adding to something to make it feel interesting, to make it feel better. And that feels good. As a player, getting something that you want getting buffed feels great because that means that something you liked is suddenly more powerful than it used to be. Conversely, nerfs generally feel bad because what happens is something that you like, that you're enjoying, that you're doing, gets taken away in some fashion. People don't like getting things taken away. It feels bad. And Polarium's got a lot of stuff that they need to juggle with this as well. Players who spend, especially in a game like this where there's a pay-to-win component, people who spend don't like spending on something and then finding out that the thing that they spent money on no longer does what they thought it was going to do. And that's a big reason that you don't see a lot of nerfs in games like this. And it's unfortunate because sometimes a little bit of a nerf is something that you need. There's also by the other hand, you have to consider the negativity of the players who are affected. If this was only a PvE game where people would just play against the environment and there's no big deal, there's a lot less incentive to do nerfs. So, oh darn, your Trunda's doing damage against Hydra. If Hydra wasn't Hydra Clash, where it's PvP, no one would really care. It'd just be kind of cool, and people would be doing it for fun, and people would be bragging rights about it, and it'd be done. But now that you suddenly have Hydra Clash, you've got issues with Trunda causing damage, and it's causing issues, and people are discussing Trunda nerfs, for example. Corporeal Cadaver was another similar situation. But overall, people just tend to not like nerfs and like buffs. So Polarium, being a business, wants to cater to people, so they definitely need to figure out who is paying. Is there going to be an issue with people stop paying when they do some of these nerfs? How is that going to affect overall player retention as well? Because that's the other thing you need to consider too. Yes, somebody might have just paid for a champion and that champion got nerfed, but if it's going to drive away the majority of the user base, that's a problem for the game as well. As somebody who would like the game to continue, obviously I'm somebody who's covering Raid, so that helps a bit too, but I enjoy the game. And if I wouldn't be covering the Raid game if I didn't enjoy it, and I wouldn't be caring about things getting nerfed or buff if I didn't enjoy the game. So let's go take a look. We'll go ahead in the index here, and I want to show you Bad El Khazar first of all, just for some context. Bad Alcazar is a wonderful champ. He is one of the kings of some of solo. He could solo Ice Golem for a long time. He could summon solo Dragon for a long time. Obviously, does not solo the hard stuff quite as well, although he's still useful in some of the hard stuff. His big solo was he has an AoE, attacks all enemies, and heals this champion and all allies by 20% of the damage inflicted. This doesn't do a lot of damage. It does okay amounts of damage, but the extra healing helps keep him alive. And then he has a cleanse on all allies, places 2 continuous heals on all allies, including himself, so he heals himself quite a bit, and places 2 poison debuffs on the enemies for 2 turns. And it's on a 3-turn cooldown. So every 3 turns, he's putting out 2 continuous heals, 2 poisons, and then spending 2 rounds using his A1 to attack other people. And the only other thing he's got going on is allies inflict 20% more damage against targets under poison, which helps boost this up a little bit to do a little bit more damage. And then you build him very fast. You use some of the masteries to speed him up even more. And he gets a bunch of poisons out before the enemy takes a turn. And they take a turn, they take a bunch of poisons, and it starts killing them. And then 2 or 3 cycles of this later, they eventually die either due to poisons or due to his A1. And he's been healing himself up, so he outlives the opponents and moves on to the next wave. Against the boss in Ice Golem and against the dragon, he would poison them to death. Overall, everyone liked Bad Al. He felt balanced. He was able to solo and able to carry food, but he wasn't so powerful because you did need decent gear. You needed to build him to solo specifically, and it often meant that you couldn't use him in other situations where you might want to. He's not going to be doing a lot of critical damage because you needed him in regeneration gear. You needed to build resistance into his kit. Oftentimes you needed very specific sets of gear as well, so there was farming involved with that as well. So there was a lot of setup involved. But overall, he felt like a good, balanced champion because he could do a couple things that some other people couldn't do, or some people could do similarly. Now, he's been power crept a bit. You had Tio that can certainly do it a little better, but we're going to specifically talk about Eurogrim because Eurogrim was a Void epic compared to a non-Void Lego. Eurogrim's Ogrin. Eurogrim has a 3-piece kit. A 4-turn cooldown where he places 2 poisons and a 15% continuous heal on all allies, very similar to Bad Al, on a 1-turn more cooldown and 1 less continuous heal. And his A1 is attacks 2 times. Each hit has a 25% chance of placing poison, bookable to 50% chance. You can hex it up to 55 or sniper up to 55. What he used to do, and this is ignoring his A3, which is removes all dust from an ally and then heals them for 40% of their max HP. His A3 used to have only a 5-turn cooldown, so it booked to 3. So it was the same cooldown as Bad Al's, placed 3 poisons, not 2, and 2 continuous heals. So just that skill, he loses out on the cleanse that Bad Al had, but he was flat out better than Bad Alcazar with that skill. I would take Eurogrim because he's got no affinity issues versus Bad Al with that skill pretty much every day, especially considering he has this cleanse for himself on his A2. And then this used to be a 3-hitter, not a 2-hitter, which meant that Eurogrim could actually put out, over the course of the 3 turns that Bad Al put out 2 poisons, Eurogrim could put out 9 poisons. That made Eurogrim flat out better than Bad Al, not to mention that he also has a 20% aura in all battles for speed. So Eurogrim was better in almost every way to Bad Al. The only thing he didn't have was the cleanse. He's got a single target cleanse. It's also got a chunky heal, so he certainly made up for it there. So removing the 1 attack, removing some buffs to make his skill absolutely worse than Bad Al's, and overall, his kit's still very good. I like Eurogrim. I used him to solo stuff a lot. He can still solo some of the stuff Bad Al does. He needs slightly better gear than Bad Al does now because Bad Al brings a lot of additional healing that Eurogrim does not. But he can still do it. He's still got the Void affinity, so he has some benefits over a Bad Al. He's still a great champion, and it's taken a while for the community to get over it. Basically, right after Eurogrim was released, Polarium realized they had a problem, and less than 2 months after he was released, they fixed him. The uproar was that they had a guaranteed event for him shortly beforehand, or some other event where it was easy to get him, and people spent money to get him because he was so good, and then they nerfed him. And in many ways, that also shows how Polarium didn't do a very good job with the champion. They shouldn't have pushed him as hard as they did in a paid event. And on top of that, they probably should have found some way to compensate people who spent money for him, or just compensate everybody who had him better than the way they did when they nerfed him. Because it was a pretty hard nerf. But if you look at what Bad L was doing, it's now in line with Bad L, him being an epic, although he's a void, versus Bad L being a legendary. So let's talk a little bit about buffs and nerfs and how to go about it. As we mentioned before, there's pay-to-win elements in Rage. That affects a lot of what you want to do. But on top of that, you want players to generally be happy. So you need to think about what champions are making people unhappy and what champions could do something better to help. So certainly one of the ways you can certainly work on buffing champions is to buff some people to deal with some of the counters that you're having problems with. There's anything from introducing new champions. For example, Narcissus was introduced and he counters Marichka and Taurus to some extent. He's a very balanced champion. He's very strong, but he has counters. There are several things that you can do to out deal with him. He doesn't feel like he has so many ways to deal with everything that he's too powerful. He's a good balanced champion, and he helps bring some balance by countering another champion. But you have to be careful about constantly bringing one champion to counter another champion, because what happens is you get a little too much of this one champion counters another one, and if you don't have enough of a circle of a pool of champions, then there's only a single counter to one champion, and you force the issue. And then in something like Live Arena, if there's only one counter to an Armands, for example, and I take that person in, if that person gets banned, well, I have to ban Armands, or else I'm still screwed because I have to hope. And if that champion that counters Armands only counters Armands, for example, and doesn't do much else outside of countering Armands, if I ban Armands, I suddenly have this dead weight of this anti-champion. So you have to be careful about having one champion that balances against other champions. So if you look for buffs, and we can use some historical examples, sometimes you just crank them up just a little bit. For example, Venus is a Void Legendary who got a slight buff. She used to have a 50% chance bookable to 75 on her burn on her A3. That got buffed to be a 100% burn. People were actually a little confused because Venus at the time was actually considered very good in Hydra, and she became absolutely amazing in Hydra with that buff. Venus was a very good and balanced champion, but they did it because there were epics that were coming out with better burns than Venus, who was a Void Legendary. And it made some sense, and it was in line with every other champion that was kind of doing HP burns at the time. And since then, there have been more HP burn champions that have come out. So it made a lot of sense, and it's kept Venus as a very good but not great champion. It took a very good champion and made her slightly better, but it made the kit make some sense. Tila Gormain's another example. Tila Gormain was the joke of Raid for a long time. She was the absolute worst legendary in the game, at least rated by many people. She had actually gotten buffed once, at least once, possibly twice, before they finally did the third buff that really made her stand out. And they did it. They brought in the Hex mechanic, which they had recently buffed, and brought it on to Tila, and added that on with her and allowed her to be an interesting champion. Now, Tila is not an absolute meta champion anymore. She honestly never really was, but she's a good champion for Hydra, very good for progression. She's very good in faction wars. She's very good in a lot of things. She brings a lot to the table, both in buffing, in damage, in healing, and even buff stealing. She's got a very good kit now. It reads very well. It makes a lot of sense. It works well. She brings a lot to the table, and she's a desirable legendary, even if she's not a top tier. And that's a good example of a buff. Taking a champion that is not relevant and buffing them into good relevance, or taking a champion that is relevant but should be a little bit better and just nudging them a little bit in the right direction. On the other hand, we have nerfs. I mentioned the Urgrim nerf. That was definitely appropriate, and Urgrim is still a very good champion. I use him a lot on my account still. Rhodos and Siphi were nerfed a long, long time ago, well before I was playing Raid Shadow Legends. They're still top tier champions. You still see them in live arena. Siphi is one of the most picked champions in live arena, for example. She's still one of the most desirable void legendaries in the game. Top 10, maybe even top 5, depending on what you're thinking. Rhodos is still one of the best single target nukers in the game, if not the best single target nuker in the game, because he brings so much to the table. Rhodos has also been nerfed by multiple champions that counter him. Harimas, your UDKs, for just 2 examples. Any of the Veil champions can certainly counter him a bit as well. There's plenty of ways to counter Rhodos, but Rhodos is still strong, and if you have a Rhodos on the team, you have to watch out for him, but you don't have to fear him above all else either, which puts him in a nice, good balance space. So nerfs really need to look at what is the core gameplay of a champion, and how do you tweak it a little bit. Increasing the cooldown is a good example. Reducing durations, changing the number of buffs or debuffs that are provided, changing the durations of those debuffs provided, tweaking a passive slightly. You know, there's all kinds of things you can certainly do to fix that. Sometimes a nerf is because of unintended consequences. Sometimes you need to fix a skill behavior. For example, they had to fix one of the masteries so that Shamael didn't absolutely go nuts. That was a good example of something that they had to fix. Uko had a bug on his A2 that would trigger stun more often than it should have. They fixed that behavior because it was unintended. It was a nerf to Uko to some extent, but it was a bug fix. There's some bug fixes that they still have that they've just kind of allowed to happen. Maybe they need to address some of those as well. So finally, looking at some of the nerfs, you know, going through all this stuff, looking at what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And to be fair, there are plenty of champions I feel need buffs more than I think there are champions that need nerfs in Raid. But there are a couple of champions I think need nerfs. I could list tons of them, you know, and I think that's a waste of time. I don't need to go off of every champion I think needs nerfs, but I'll bring a couple of them up just for examples of something that I might do. You've got Marichka and Taurus are a good example. They're still very powerful. They are pretty much the most powerful void legendaries in the game, and as a pair, they are absolutely brutal because they make each other even better. I don't want to break that. I don't mind them being some of the most powerful champions in the game, but one of the ways you could fix some of them a little bit, Marichka, for example, doesn't have a cooldown on her revive everybody when she dies passive. Make it a 1-turn cooldown. So that means that if you kill her, she gets revived, and you kill her again before she gets a chance to take a turn, she doesn't do her revive automatically. Very minor, doesn't make a huge change in how well she works, and it still means you have to figure out how to outrace her to kill her before she gets a turn, which sometimes is very difficult. But it adds just a little bit of recovery to an otherwise very difficult and very frustrating gameplay loop of Marichka reviving and then getting revived and reviving and getting revived and reviving and getting revived. Taurus actually has, it's probably not a bug, unfortunately, but Taurus, his damage doesn't work like any other not max HP, but any other HP champion in the game. When his max HP drops, his damage does not. His damage is set based off of his HP the moment he steps into battle, not what it is at the time. If you took that away from him, then suddenly you could possibly counter Taurus by dropping his HP. It also means that his damage mitigation would be at the cost of some of his own damage, which means that you could actually attack him with some attack champions and not have the attack champions eventually become near useless because their attack is constantly going down against a Taurus, whereas Taurus continues to smack and smack and smack and smack. Maybe they'd have to rework how he recovers that a little bit to fix that. But overall, because he doesn't work like other max HP champions, he doesn't counter like some of the other HP champions. And that's a problem. Finally, Armanz. And that's really, I think, what a lot of this is about. Armanz being one of the latest fusions. There's a lot of people that are really liking him. He is really powerful. And honestly, if he was only so powerful because it was versus player versus environment, PvE, it wouldn't be a big issue. But he's at a 70% ban rate in live arena. In live arena, especially at the top end, You pick Armands if you go first, because if you don't, the opponent does, and then that's got to be your ban. Because if you don't ban Armands, he is almost impossible to deal with unless you know you can not only outspeed him, but you can neutralize or kill him before he gets a chance to take a turn. Because the moment he gets a chance to take a turn, he can lock out your entire team and keep locking them out and keep them stun locked and keep them sheeped, and you'll never get a turn. And that's not a fun gameplay loop, and it's not a fair gameplay loop. His A2 has a 3-turn cooldown when booked, a 100% AoE stun, and a turn meter removal and steal for the entire turn meter. There is one other champ in the game that has a 100% stun, AoE, and a 3 turns cooldown, and that's Goffred. And Goffred is not considered broken by any way, shape, or form. Goffred's actually a good champion. He actually probably should get a little more love in Arena than he does because he's got an interesting kit. But the problem is that the AoE stun itself isn't the big deal. It's also the 100% steal of the turn meter. So being stunned and having 100% of your turn meter stolen basically means you've taken them out of the fight for 2 full turns. So the one turn to get the stun off, and then the next turn to actually take a turn again. At which point in time Armands, who stole all your turn meter and so is immediately taking the next turn, then can do his A3 if he wants to, or even just his A1 and lock you out of something, and then needs to take one more turn, and then he gets his stun back, or his the stun and the drain back, and can do it again. Meanwhile, you've got the enemy has an entire other team that hopefully is getting a chance to go while they've locked out most of your champions. And that's really not a fun gameplay loop. Keep the AoE stun, or maybe keep the turn meter steal, but you can't really do on a 3-turn cooldown on both. And maybe even if it's the turn meter steal, which to be fair, I think the turn meter steal is a slightly more interesting mechanic because it's different than stun. It still has some different implications of different champions counter turn meter removal than stun. Obviously, Stone Skin counters both of them, but there are some champions that are just immune to stun, and there are some champions that are immune to turn meter steal. So it gives you a little bit of variety to have one person that does stun and one person does the turn meter steal. I think that's good. But if it's the turn meter steal, I think you may also then want to kick it to a 4-turn cooldown. But that's just me brainstorming. Obviously, I'm not Raid, I'm not Polarium. I can only think to some of these things and suggest them. What do you guys think? What do you guys think about the topic of nerfing? Hopefully I have kept you guys through the video and you're not rioting and getting me canceled right now. I really hope you're not getting me canceled. Not hearing the walls knock on me. But definitely appreciate you guys hanging out through this. And what are your thoughts on nerfs and raid? And what are your thoughts on Marichka, Taurus, Amans, or any champion you think does need a nerf? Or maybe you think that a bunch of champions need buffs and that'll counter the issue. So let me know down below. Till later, I've been Bront, CatHerder.